Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some magical lilac cards using the new Spring Meadow collection from Hero Arts. We have the No One Lilac U Stampin' Cut Stamp and Die set here. Beautiful images, perfect for spring and the summer. And if you love florals like I do, perfect. Then we have the layered lilac die set. Lots of dimension that you can create using this die set to create your cards. We have the everyday sentiment strips die or stamp set that creates a lot of different sentiments easily all at once. And then we have the Birdsong script stamp set. I'm going to be using this for a background for one of my cards. This is perfect for backgrounds and adding just that extra little bit of visual texture in the background. I'm going to be using Magicals pigment powders or Lindys Magical pigment powders. I'm going to be using the Victorian Bouquet one, and I'm going to share 5 different ways of using it. Now, the first thing I want to do is create a background to use that layered lilac die set to die cut those pieces out. You could also create, say, a distressed background to create a somewhat similar look, but I love that these Magicals have shimmer properties to them. You can get sets that are flat that don't have shimmer to them, but I really love the addition that shimmer gives you. I'm using the Victorian Bouquet set, and I have some pieces of mixed media Heavystock here. I have them in quarter sheets, so they're 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, nice and easy to work with. And I used a mighty mister to use on both sides of my cardstock as well as my surface to push that cardstock down. It kind of suctions it down. It keeps it from curling. Then I'm using a fan brush to use the purple and the pink from this set to just lightly sprinkle it over my background there. You can see that because I already have the water on there, it's starting to spread out, but I do spray extra water. I always use lots and lots of water when I'm doing these backgrounds because I want those colors to blend and bleed into each other. Then I let them dry completely. Now, the hardest thing with using these Magicals to create a background like this is because I use a ton of water for it, it does take a long time for them to dry. So I will typically do these backgrounds the day before I want to die cut and use these for creating cards. That way I give them plenty of time to dry. I can be nice and patient with them. I'm also working on my Tim Holtz Media surface mat here. So it's a great surface to work on for doing a lot of these different background pieces here. Now I'm going to do another piece with the blue and the green from this set. I tell you the colors, but I forget what the actual color names are. They're all from the Victorian Bouquet Magical set. However, if you wanted to change the colors a little bit, you could use ones from other sets as well. I just really like the color combination of this one, especially for the lilacs. Now, I love florals, but I love the non-traditional colors of them. So for lilacs, while I love the purple, I really like the pink and then the cream ones. So I do have pink on here because I wanted to add that pink tone to them. I wanted to have a little bit of the purple, but I wanted to also have some of those pinks in there. So my backgrounds here, this is the next day. These are completely dried. And you can see that even though the paper is curled a little bit, they didn't curl nearly as much as they would have had I not sprayed both sides with water. For that reason, it does take an extra long time for them to dry. However, those Magicals tend to stay where I want them to when I do this. So I prefer the result of it. And I think waiting that extra time is definitely worth it. So I have my pieces from my lilac die set here. I'm going to cut them out, and I can pick and choose which part of those backgrounds I want to cut out. I'm going to make 2 cards using these dies. Now I want to do one card where I'm pretty much using all of the magical backgrounds for creating those florals for my card. Then I'm going to create another one where I'm using part of the Magicals backgrounds for parts of it. And then I'm also mixing it with some solid cardstock. So you get a combination of the Magicals background with that shimmer and then the solid matte cardstock. So I'm going to die cut these pieces and then set them all aside. I've done a couple here on screen. The rest of them I'm going to be doing off screen. Now I like to use a tool-in-one in order to poke out a lot of those little pieces from the die set. I'll typically do this right over top of my garbage can, so all those little pieces go directly into the garbage. Anything that doesn't pop out, I can use the pointy part of my tool-in-one to just poke them out. They come out really nice and easily. So this die set has a base die, then it has a layer one here. Those are the 2 pieces that I've die cut, and then it has some individual flowers in 3 different sizes. So what I typically will do is I will die cut the large pieces, then I will go in with those smaller flowers, and there's two different types of dies here. There's ones with those smaller flowers in like a row that you can create four or cut four at a time, and then there's individual ones. So I will cut those large pieces first, and then I will take those scraps and I will cut the smaller pieces, and then I will start cutting individual flowers. So I will cut up pretty much my entire background as much as I can possibly cut up to get as many of those flowers as possible. Now I don't need quite as many leaves, and for one of my cards, I'm just using the solid leaf. The other one, I'm going to be using just the vines or the veins of that leaf. Now I've cut those things out and set them aside. I'll put them together in just a moment, but I wanted to use the Magicals for another background or another technique with this No One Lilac U Stampin' Cut set. So I haven't used this set yet, so I use a white eraser on the stamping surface, remove any possible manufacturing residue to make sure that that stamp takes ink really well. I use a little bit of embossing powder tool on that cardstock, and then I stamp it with some VersaMark ink. I'm going to heat emboss this with some silver embossing powder. I typically like doing that, especially when I'm doing water techniques, because it adds that little bit of extra texture. It also adds that little bit of ridge for the embossing powder or for my stamped image or my watercolor to sit in. Now, you can see that I didn't get full stamping on the center of the flower there, so I'm going to rub off that embossing powder. And I use the opposite side of the cardstock. So this isn't that same side of the cardstock. Now, a little background information here. You'll see me make a few mistakes in this video, and not to say that I don't ever make mistakes in other videos as well. Sometimes I share them if I think they have some learning information to them. Sometimes I edit them out. However, full disclosure, I threw my back out the day before, or before the weekend that I was working on some of these pieces to this. So my brain isn't totally there because I'm thinking about the back pain. So when you see them, some of the mistakes I do are kind of Ricky mistakes, especially in just a moment. I stamp the sentiments to emboss the sentiments, and it takes me 3 times before I get a full stamping of that sentiment for the powder to stick to, which in hindsight, it's kind of funny because I've been stamping for years and I know better. And that's why I just shared the disclosure, because my brain is thinking about my back and not what I'm doing. But because the techniques that I'm doing take some drying time to them, I wanted to be doing some of the pieces to them over the weekend when I usually don't do any filming, so that I would have plenty of time for those pieces to dry for the week when I wanted to put the cards together. So I took some of the single stems of those lilacs plus the sentiments, and this is where you'll see that I didn't get a full stamping of those sentiments. So just like that first image there, I just rub it off of the cardstock. There's no point in even embossing that onto the cardstock there. Then I do my heat embossing of those lilac images there. Now this is for a second card with that Stampin' Cut. So I want to do one with that full image with those lilacs in the vase. Then I want to do some where I'm just arranging some of these single stems together on the card. Now these all have dies that coordinate with them, so I can cut them out perfectly for those cards so you can arrange them how you like. Another option would be to use that full image with the vase and add some of these single stems to them just to give it a little bit of extra dimension. So after embossing that first piece, I turned it a quarter turn, stamped it a second time, and here you can see that I once again didn't get a full stamping of that sentiment, so I just rub it off. Then on the left side of that cardstock, because I had rubbed the sentiment off before, that ink was still there, so the embossing powder still stuck to it. What I should have done was put a little bit of embossing powder tool on there. That would have helped. However, using a fine brush to remove any of that embossing powder, fix that right up. There's a lot of detail in the flower, so if there's any lines from that sentiment in there, you really won't see it at all. So I've got those two pieces done that I want to get done for this card. Now I can add my sentiment. I'm going to put it just in the center of this cardstock piece here. Add a little bit of embossing powder tool here to try to help what I had done with this last time. And then I go to stamp that image with that VersaMark ink. Now, when you're using VersaMark ink, sometimes you can look to the side to see if you get a full and clear stamped image. And sometimes that just doesn't work. So it's still, the embossing powder is still stuck to some of that VersaMark ink that was on the cardstock, but not enough to affect that sentiment. So this one here, I can fully heat emboss. Then I go with my next piece here because I am going to be die cutting these pieces out. That top of that cardstock there is kind of a waste of cardstock if I'm not going to be using it. So I'm going to stamp my sentiment here. And this is another one where I didn't get a full image or a full stamping of that sentiment. And you can see it when, and the funny thing was I had looked to the side, I just couldn't see the VersaMark ink on there, but you can see it as soon as I put that powder on there, it comes right off. So if you do these things, they're common mistakes, and I've been stamping for, I think it's 30 years now plus. I still make those mistakes, especially sometimes right after I've thrown my back out. So I wiped that off, put a little bit of embossing powder tool there, and because I'm using the Misti stamping tool, I know when I'm stamping here, I'm stamping in exactly the same spot because I have my cardstock in the bottom left corner of that stamping tool. So I go and try it again, making sure to press on the center of that sentiment so that I make sure that I get the impression there. And here we finally have the full sentiment. So I'm going to heat emboss that. Now I'm using mixed media Heavystock here because I'm using a lot of water. You need to use a cardstock that can handle that water. Watercolor cardstock would work for these as well. However, I chose not to use that because watercolor cardstock has some texture to it, some divots to it. And sometimes the liquid will just kind of sit in those little dimples, and I wanted a nice flat surface for this. So for my next technique with these Magicals, I'm using my water brush to watercolor in some of the areas of the lilacs there. Then I'm going to be using my fan brush to drop those pieces or drop the powder down on that water. Now, I really only want this to stick where I have my water. This is a technique that I thought about, but I haven't actually tried yet. So my first attempt at it didn't quite work exactly how I wanted it to. I needed more water on those pieces. So for my next attempt here, I'm using a lot more water. I'm going outside the lines. These are going to be die cut. And yes, there is a halo with them when they're die cut, but I didn't think it mattered for the look that I was going for. So for the second attempt here, I am much more liberal with the water on my images. Then I use the fan brush, and I typically use a fan brush for dropping these powders down because you can get just teeny tiny amounts of that powder. You can control it a little bit better. It also has two ends, so when I change color, I can just flip that brush over. I put those powders down on that stamped image, and then I use my Mighty Mister to blend those inks together, if you will, to spread them out. And you can see that I'm not concerned with getting them on the background. I even get it on my sentiment, but that just gives that sentiment a colored background to it. But it's a lot more of an interesting colored background than, say, just using ink blending around it. So I'm going to let that completely dry. Now for that one, I didn't do the spraying all over the piece on the front and back. So you can see that that paper is curved because it's only wet at the top. This is the thing that I was avoiding when I went to go do it for my first background, because that ink runs to the side of the paper and I wanted to avoid that. So for my next image here, I'm doing the same technique. I'm having a little bit more control than the first one there. I did make sure to use extra water. I sprinkle that pigment powder on top of there, and then I did use that alcohol blower tool in order to brush or to blow any excess powder off of there. Then I'll use my Mighty Mister to blend those powders. And if they're too dark, you can easily use a paper towel to dab up that extra color just to lighten it a little bit. You can have some control over it that way. So I'll set those aside and let those dry completely. Then I'm going to use those pigment powders to watercolor with. So I'm going to use my same brush, but this time what I'm doing, I'm making sure it's nice and clean. I'm dipping my wet brush right into those powders, and I will use my surface as an ink palette. So you can get lighter colors with more water and less pigment. You can get darker colors with more pigment and less water. So you have a little bit of control over it. So you're still going to get the color. It's going to coordinate beautifully with the other cards because they're the same exact colors, but we're using them in different ways. So there's no reason, these pigment powders are water soluble, so there's no reason you can't watercolor with them. And you can have a lot of fun with them, and your watercolor will have that little bit of shimmer because these pigment powders have that shimmer to them. So I use the green on the leaves, and typically when I'm doing watercolor on leaves, I'll make sure that I've got a darker tone towards the base of the leaf and a lighter tone towards the tip of the leaf. So I will typically watercolor with a lighter color or start where I want the color to be darker and then work my way out. When there's less ink on the brush, then that end will be a little bit lighter. If it's too light to start with, you can always use the darker color and tip it or dot the brush in that wet paint and it will start to blend and bleed. If you happen to have too much color on there, you can take your clean brush, just a wet brush, and remove some of that color, just brush it off. And then you can see that I have a paper towel to my right. I am using that to clean off my brush, or I'm using that to take some of the excess moisture out of my brush. The type of water brush that I like to use has water right in the handle, so it's very low mess. Perfect for people like me that are accident prone. If I had a bottle of water or a jar of water at my desk, there's a good chance that I would tip it over. So by having the water right in my handle, I don't have to worry about that. When I want to change colors, I just go to that paper towel and squeeze my brush and it flushes all of the color right out of the brush. If I happen to have too much moisture or too much color on my brush, I do the same thing. I'll tip it onto the paper towel to control that. So I also want to have a little bit of the purple behind my sentiment here. So I just took that purple, put it on my brush, diluted it a little bit on my surface, and then I painted it right over that sentiment so that can dry as well as my image. Now for my background here, for that Birdsong script stamp set, I'm going to use it in two different ways to create backgrounds for these cards. Once again, I'm using that mixed media Heavystock. I put some VersaMark ink on that stamp and then put one of those pieces of cardstock on that stamp, rubbing behind it to make sure to transfer that ink. I put one to the side and then I repeated that same process. And for the second one here, I'm adding some silver embossing powder to it. So I'm going to do an emboss resist technique with those magical powders for this particular one here. I poured that powder on, took that excess that went on the scrap paper, put it back into the jar. That's one of the reasons why I love embossing, because there's very little waste to it. And then I used my embossing tool to melt that powder on that background. So for this background, I chose the silver embossing powder because it'll coordinate with the silver embossing powder I used for those stamped images for the No One Lilac You stamps. Now, this could be any color of embossing powder, so it doesn't necessarily need to be silver. I chose silver because I thought it would be a nice complement to the pinks and the purples of the flowers, but really you could choose whichever one you want. You could even use an embossing glaze to have some colored lines to it, but I like the silver because it has a little bit of contrast to those colors. For my other background, I am taking the Magicals pigment powders and I'm just putting them lightly on that background. I have the 4 of them here, the pink, the purple, the blue, and the green. I'm trying to focus a little bit more on the pink and the purple, but I do want to have a little bit of that blue and green there. Now, this is the one that just has that VersaMark stamped background to it. So lightly, very, very lightly, I just kind of brush that powder over top, and then I use a Swiffer duster to remove that, and you can see that it is stuck to that VersaMark ink. However, we want to do one more step to make sure that that ink really sets. So I misted it lightly with that with that Mighty Mister. It just hydrates that ink. It makes sure that it brightens it up because of that hydration. And that way, when that ink dries, it's not going to fall off. You're not going to get smears of ink on there. It's going to set it a little bit better. Now, when you mist it, that ink is going to start to run a little bit. So it's not a background that you can read those words. You also can't really read them with this embossing. That script there is so tiny that it's hard to read in the first place, but it's a great way to add texture and just something a little bit interesting to your background. So once I've done that one with just the VersaMark ink, I'm going to do the emboss resist one. This is the one that I embossed with that silver powder. Put that ink or that powder on top of there and then mist it up. This is very similar to that first background, except that we have that stamped and embossed text on the back of it. And I didn't quite use as much water to it. Once I put that water on there, I also used the paper towel to pick up some of that color. I wanted it to be a little bit muted. I didn't want it to be so bright that when we put our images on in front of it, that you wouldn't really be able to see those images. I wanted to have that texture in that background that coordinated with the images, but I didn't necessarily want to take the attention away. Once all of these are dry, I can use the coordinating die sets to cut out those lilac pieces. When I do cut them out, I use some Best Ever craft tape in order to tape my dies in place. I want to make sure that those dies stay where I want them to when I'm doing that die cutting, and this is the best way to do it, especially for something like this where I used water on mixed media cardstock. Even though mixed media cardstock can handle that water, it still warps as it dries. It's not going to stay completely flat. And because of that, it adds a little extra challenge to die cutting. So by taping those dies in place, I can make sure that they're not going to move on me with that warped paper. So I tape as many dies in place as I can. One thing to remember when you're die cutting more than one thing at once, you want to make sure that your dies do not overlap each other. If they overlap each other, you're going to ruin your die going through the machine. So make sure that they have some space between them. Once you have those dies down, you can die cut those pieces and then they're ready to go to start assembling cards. Now, when I'm doing a bunch of techniques like this to create cards, I like doing all of these bits and pieces first, so then I can assemble my cards all at one time, and then I don't have to worry about stopping in the middle of something and creating a sentiment, or stopping and then watercoloring. And then, so I do all of these things, especially the things that have some drying time to them that I can do ahead of time. I have them so I have all of my pieces there waiting and ready to go for me. So I have these pieces here. I absolutely love the look of this. It's just got such a unique look to it. I also pulled out my Infinity Oval die sets from Hero Arts to create some different oval level layers behind. Even though on that stamp or that embossed resist Magicals background, even though I used that paper towel to mute those colors, it was still a little bit too bright and a little bit too busy with those lilacs right on top of that. So by adding those layers of ovals, I still get that background with that texture. I still get the two colors that coordinate well, but I'm going to be able to highlight the stamped and embossed lilacs a little bit better. So I have, after creating the oval mats, I have some matte silver cardstock that I trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and then, or 5 3/8, and then I trimmed my Magicals background there to 4 by 5 1/4. I glued that to an A2 card base, and I used that silver paper, the matte silver, just to create a mat behind that Magicals piece. You don't necessarily need it, but because we have that silver embossing, it's just a great way to tie that in and frame it in nicely. And I also had used that silver to create a silver mat around one of my ovals. That other oval is die cut out of Windy cardstock, which is a light blue. And it's ink blended with some Mermaid Lagoon Distress ink just to frame it in and just to bring that darker blue color in our Magicals out just a little bit. And it's only lightly ink blended. Again, I'm trying to frame and highlight this little vase with the lilacs here. I'm not trying to overpower them. I want to show them off nicely. And that Windy cardstock, while I liked the light color, it was just a little bit too pale. So adding that Mermaid Lagoon was the perfect touch. For the last detail for these cards, I'm using some stickles for the centers of the flowers. Now, these stickles are Stardust stickles. They don't have any color to them. They're just an iridescent, so they pretty much go with anything. And what this is going to do is just going to highlight the centers of those flowers. It's going to draw your attention, and it's going to give a little bit of extra texture and just a touch of sparkle. So once I have those stickles on there, I'm going to set those aside to dry and then start working on my other card. So that stickles, you can see that it doesn't add any color to it. It just adds some texture and some sparkle. So for my next card, I'm using that background that we had the Magicals on with just that Birdsong stamp set stamped with VersaMark ink, and then we brushed those powders on them. For this mat, I'm once again cutting that to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 inch. That one was some orchid cardstock. And then I'm taking my Magicals background here and trimming it to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I have smaller mats on these pieces because those lilac pieces are a little bit larger, as well as the fact that I want to add these oval backgrounds to them. So I want to make sure that I have as much space as possible on that A2 card base. For this one, I decided to do an oval feature on the front of the card. I didn't want to create a solid background behind them, but I wanted there to be a little bit more detail than just those lilac sprigs. So I used 4 different sizes of my ovals, some with the orchid cardstock, some with mulberry cardstock. The mulberry is the darker color, the orchid is the lighter color. I'm creating a thicker oval and a thinner oval. So we're going to create that detail and they're going to layer on top of each other on the front of the card. Now that mulberry one is the piece that I'm using for the mat behind. I said orchid before, but I realized now that I said the wrong name. I made sure to choose my oval sizes so that I could still use that as a mat on my card. It doesn't matter if something's cut out of the center of it because we're putting things over top of it. That's going to be completely hidden and it just extends the use of my cardstock a little bit. This way I created 2 different pieces for the front of my card out of one 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch piece of cardstock, and no one would ever know. Rather than using 2 different pieces, why not just use one? Just extends the cardstock. This is especially helpful with specialty cardstocks because they tend to be a little bit more pricey. Once I have that outline, that matte piece on there, I can glue down my Magicals background, and then I can glue down those 2 ovals. And those pieces from those ovals that they were cut out of, those centers, can either be used for other cards or they can be used for die cutting other pieces for future projects. So those don't get wasted either. Once I've layered those 2 pieces on there, I put my acrylic block on there. I use this acrylic block often to hold things down nice and flat while I'm assembling my cards. That way it frees up my hands to work on other things. But another great use for it is while something is drying, you can lay pieces on top of it, see exactly how it looks on your background, and then you can lift that block up, put it to the side, know exactly where you had everything, so you're not rearranging everything. Once I have those lilac sprigs glued down, I can glue down my sentiment, and we have another card nearly done. Just like my last one, I'm going to put some stickles in the centers of those flowers. It's something that I do often, not just with stamped images, but I also do them with die cut images as well. I think it just adds some extra detail, and I really love the fact it adds that extra little bit of texture. So once that's done, I can set that aside and let those stickles dry. Those stickles are just dots, so they will dry in like 10-15 minutes. They won't take long at all. So now that we have our stamped and magical backgrounds done, we can work on our die cut pieces. And I just showed you a flash of one of those Magicals backgrounds, how much was cut out of it. There's very little left over of it. So I do use as much of those backgrounds as possible. If I don't use a whole background, I save them for future projects. So I'm first going to do the card where I'm using the Magicals for all of the die cut pieces. So I'm going to use my Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle. I use this glue for pretty much 90-95% of my projects. I love liquid glue because it gives you that room to move and shimmy things in place. I'm also going to be using a paper sculpting kit. This one's from Spellbinders, but it's discontinued, so I'll link one that is similar. I have a nice thick foam pad, and I have 2 styluses here on my tool-in-one. I have my flower die cut face down, the magical side down, and I'm using a medium-sized stylus in just a circular motion to kind of cup those pieces. Then I flip them around and I use a small stylus to push in the center so that there's a dip in the center and those petals have some curve to them. I'm going to do this before I start to assemble because I don't want to be assembling and have to stop and shape my petals. I want to make sure that everything is ready to go. So just like my first stamped image or stamped card, I used a piece of windy cardstock with a oval die, one of the infinity oval dies. And I did a little bit of ink blending with that Mermaid Lagoon Distress ink. For this one, I have one of the larger dies used to die cut a Magicals background. And then I'm going to put that smaller one over top of it. So that background is going to coordinate beautifully with the lilacs here. So after putting those 2 layers down, I can start to assemble my lilac on the front. I typically will put my stem down first just so that I know exactly where that flower is intended to be. Another option, if you have a certain way you want your flower to go, you can put that flower down and then insert that stem underneath it. Then I go and add some of those leaves. Now this is a great use or a great reason to use liquid glue here because when I go to do my last leaf, I want that first one sitting over top of it. Because I use that liquid glue, it hasn't started to set yet, so I can easily alter it and lift that leaf up over top of the larger one. Once I have those pieces down, I can start to glue down my individual flowers. Now, just like the die cut here, I'm going to put the larger flowers towards the bottom and then kind of taper towards the top where I have smaller ones. Because of those little cuppings in there, I just put the glue on the pointed part at the bottom of that flower. just a dot of glue in there. And when I'm gluing it to the flowers, I'm kind of gluing it between the other flowers that they have in there. Now this die set also has a die that cuts out little teeny tiny circles for the centers of those flowers. Once again, I'm going to put stickles in there because I prefer that for the center of the flower. And I will typically do like Stardust stickles, but they come in a bunch of different colors. If you wanted colors, you can absolutely do that as well. Another option would be to use Perfect Pearls or Nouveau drops in here. It adds that extra little bit of shine and dimension, and it's just a little bit easier than teeny tiny circle die cuts. So that's also one of the reasons why I use it, because those little teeny circle die cuts I think would be a little bit more challenging to be gluing in place. Now off screen, I created a couple more sentiments from that No One Lilac U Stampin' Cut. However, I had intended to create sentiments from the Everyday Sentiments stamp and use those on these cards. I'm going to blame the back pain because in the middle of the different days of doing this, I completely forgot that that set existed until I was cleaning up once I had all of my cards done. So I had intended to use those as sentiment stamp strips. I ended up using the ones from the No One Lilac U. So I'm going to be using that stamp set in a different video to share that there. So again, I used stickles in the centers of those flowers, and then I set that aside to completely dry. Now for this card here, this is the one where I'm using a combination of solid cardstock with the Magicals backgrounds. So I have this leftover piece here from the windy cardstock from the oval from my last card. I put a little bit of Mermaid Lagoon ink on the inside to ink that in. Then I have the base of my die or of my lilacs here in orchid cardstock. I'm going to ink that with some Seedless Preserved Distress ink. I have my leaves cut out of Seaside cardstock as a really pale mint. I did a little bit of ink blending on there with some Evergreen Bough. So those ink blending is just going to add that extra little bit of visual dimension to it. Something that's super easy to do, and I don't use a ton of ink, just a little bit just to give it some extra detail. Then I can glue my flowers on top. Now my intention was to use the ovals left over from my last card to create a frame around this lilac card. Once again, in the process of assembling this, I completely forgot those pieces existed. So I actually don't do that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But those pieces, don't put them away where you don't actually see them, because you might be like me and might forget that they exist. For this particular one, my leaves are die cut out of that Seaside cardstock that was ink blended, and the veins to the leaves were die cut out of the Magicals background, so they coordinate nicely. They add that extra little bit of shimmer, and they add the extra detail to the veins. I didn't add the veins to the last card because they were done out of the Magicals background. I thought they had enough going on with them already, and I didn't think the veins on top of them would really add anything extra to those pieces. So once those are assembled, I put them under my acrylic block to let them dry while I'm shaping my flowers. These flowers are shaped exactly like the last ones. These ones are also die cut out of the Magical background. So I used the medium stylus on the back of the flowers, kind of creating a cup, flipped them over, and then used the small stylus to just press in the center to shape or to do the final shaping of the flowers. So at this point, this is the point where I would add the ovals or the oval frames to this card. I would glue them together and trim them down. However, I completely forgot they existed, so I didn't do that. I'm gluing this straight to that card base, and I really like the way this turned out as well, but it doesn't make sense why I ink blended that oval if I'm not actually using it here. So I wanted to address that while I was putting them together. Just like the last time, I put my stem down first and then put the head of the flowers on top. This time I changed the order I glued my leaves down, just simply because I wanted them to be somewhat similar to the last one, and I knew that I had put the smaller leaf on top of the bigger one. So I glued the bigger one down first and then the smaller one on top of it. Now I'm ready to glue those individual flowers down, and just like the last time, I start with the larger ones towards the bottom, work my way towards the top. They come in 3 different sizes. There's a large, medium, and small. So I'll do the large ones first, then I will do the medium ones, and then I will do the small ones. Now I just did, I think, 1 die cutting of each one and then a few extra flowers for this. And I use all of the flowers that I created. You could easily die cut more flowers if you want them to be a little bit fuller. I love the fact that with dies like this, you can really customize it and you can really get it as full or as sparse as you would like it. It's really a personal preference thing, but I love the look that you get with those magicals. And like I said at the beginning of the video, you could, if you wanted, create like a distressed background and you would get a somewhat similar look to this. But those magicals really have some unique looks to them, and I love the way they look with things like this. So once I have those glued down, I can go and add my sentiment to my card. And once again, I had intended to use the Everyday Sentiment strips for this to add the sentiment, but I ended up using one of the sentiments from the No One Lilac U. I did emboss them with the silver embossing powder because I like the look that that silver would give them, as well as that extra dimension you get from heat embossing. Then I use those stickles in the centers of the flowers and let that dry. And because those stickles are just little dots, they really don't take very long to dry at all. I want to say maybe 10-15 minutes. It really just depends on how big of a dot you're adding there, but it does dry fairly quickly. It just adds that extra little bit of texture and it just catches the light so beautifully. And because they're opalescent or iridescent stickles, they go with any color. So I use them for many different things. So here is the card after it has dried, and this is when I realized that I had those ovals that I had intended to add to the front there. Now I had intended to put them down first and then put my lilac on top of that. At this point I was wondering whether I could salvage it at all, but it was going to cover too much of that lilac as well as the leaves and the sentiment. And with it on top of it, it didn't have quite the same look as I had originally envisioned. So I opted to just leave them off and just talk about it. But if you were to add these pieces, I would do them before adding the lilac on top so that you have that lilac framed and that frame is just kind of in the background. But even without that frame, it creates a little bit more of a simple look. And I really love the extra shimmer you get from those magicals in the background, as well as that sparkle from the stickles and the colors blending together. It just really creates a really unique look to it. Then we have our other die cut card there with the oval right behind the lilacs, really framing them. I love that pop of blue behind it because I think it just makes that lilac really pop off of the page. I didn't show the side view of there. There's dimension to the card, but it's not extreme dimension like some shaped or sculpted flowers that I've done in the past, but it has some beautiful dimension to it. Then we have our magicals kind of watercolored-ish lilacs there, and then that background using that VersaMark ink with the magicals on top of it, and then just misted. Then our very first stamped card there where we did a little bit of the magicals on the lilacs, then we watercolored the leaves in the vase, and then we have that emboss resist background. So many different ways to use those magical pigment powders. They come in so many different color combinations as well, so you can really find different colors that work best for you or the project that you're creating. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.